The rift opened without ceremony. No crackling light show, no thunderclap announcement. Just a tear in the fabric of what should have been a condemned warehouse in South Chicago. Blade mid-stride, sword already drawn, 3 vampire lieutenants dissolving into ash behind him. And then nothing. A half-second of absolute sensory void, like the universe had exhaled and forgotten to inhale. And then Georgia hit him all at once. Heat first, thick, wet, suffocating southern summer heat that pressed against him like a physical wall, carrying with it a smell that stopped him cold. Death. Rot. The specific, unmistakable perfume of decomposing flesh, but wrong somehow. Massive in scale, layered over everything like a coat of paint over an entire world. In Chicago, that smell meant a nest. Here, it seemed to mean outside. Blade landed in a crouch on cracked asphalt. The transition from warehouse floor to a weed-split parking lot of what had once been a rural Georgia gas station, seamless enough that his body barely registered the shift. His mind, however, was already working, cataloging. The sword stayed up. The world around him was silent in the way that only truly abandoned places ever get. 2 rusted cars sat at the pumps, doors hanging open, a child's shoe on the pavement between them. The gas station's windows were long since shattered. Hand-painted letters on a piece of plywood read, "Don't stop, keep moving," the apostrophe missing, the urgency not. A sun-bleached American flag hung motionless in the dead air above the canopy, and below it, impaled on a rusted flagpole bracket, was a human skull that had been there long enough for birds to nest in the eye socket. He had been in hellish places before. This felt different. The first one came around the corner of the building 30 seconds after arrival, and Blade's assessment was instantaneous. Humanoid. Bipedal, moving with that particular shambling wrongness that his nervous system flagged as threat before his conscious mind even processed the visual. Pale, gray-green skin stretched tight over the cheekbones, one arm hanging at an angle that suggested the shoulder had been dislocated sometime after death and never set. The eyes were the tell. Blade had looked into the eyes of the undead more times than most people had hot meals. Vampire eyes held hunger, cunning, predatory intelligence, sometimes centuries of it burning behind the gaze. These eyes held nothing. He let it come to within 4 feet and then took its head off with one clean lateral stroke, the titanium blade parting desiccated vertebrae with a sound like cracking wood. The body dropped. He stood over it and studied what was left. No ash, no dissolution, no theatrical death rattle of the kind that vampires so reliably produced. It simply fell and stayed fallen, and the severed head continued to move for another 11 seconds, jaw working, those empty eyes tracking nothing, before finally going still. Blade crouched, examined the wound. The biology was wrong for a vampire in almost every measurable way. The blood, and there was blood, thick and dark and smelling of advanced decomposition, carried none of the markers his enhanced senses associated with the vampiric infection. No trace of the specific viral compound that Deacon Frost's research had identified 40 years ago. No hemoglobin predation. The thing had been human once, and something had animated it after death. But whatever that something was, it was not vampirism as Eric Brooks understood vampirism. He stood, scanned the tree line, counted 8 more shapes moving at the edge of his vision, all with the same shambling, purposeless gait, all drawn toward him by sound. Different world, he thought, and the thought carried no panic. Blade did not panic, but it carried weight. The rift had been clean. He had felt no return pull. Whatever had happened in that Chicago warehouse, whatever interaction between the Darkhold fragment and the vampire elder's death scream had torn that hole in dimensional space. It had deposited him here with no obvious mechanism for departure. He filed that under problems to solve later and addressed the 8 walkers in 11 seconds. The UV grenade on his belt stayed there. He needed information before burning resources. The serum syringes, calibrated specifically for vampire cardiovascular systems, were almost certainly useless here. But the sword worked fine. The sword always worked fine. When the last one dropped, he stood in the gas station parking lot, surrounded by bodies that refused to be anything but bodies. And he breathed in the ruined world around him. Miles of it. So whatever had happened here had not happened recently. The infrastructure decay, the vegetation reclaiming the roads, the complete absence of any electrical hum that modern civilization produced like background radiation. This had been going on for at least a year. Maybe longer. There were no vampires in this world. He was certain of that within the first 5 minutes. His senses had a range and a specificity that went far beyond human detection. And the only thing he could feel for miles in every direction were the dead that didn't know they were dead. And somewhere to the northwest, a cluster of living heartbeats that told him human survivors existed in numbers. He cleaned his blade on the sleeve of a walker, sheathed it across his back, and oriented toward those heartbeats. In his world, Eric Brooks existed to protect humanity from monsters. He looked out at the gray-green shapes emerging from the tree line in 1s and 2s, an endless patient tide of them, and recalibrated his purpose with the cold efficiency that had kept him alive for decades in a war most humans didn't know was being fought. The monsters here were different. The mission wasn't. He started walking northwest. If you want to see more crossover battles and unexpected universe collisions, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character and universe you'd want to see in the comments below. Let's explore the infinite together. He smelled the prison before he saw it. Not the death smell. That was everywhere now, a constant atmospheric fact of this world that his senses had already begun filtering to background noise the way a man living near a highway eventually stops hearing traffic. This was different. This was wood smoke and cooked meat, and the specific human combination of sweat and effort and close quarters living that meant a population. A real one. Organized. And he could distinguish at least a dozen individual scent signatures from half a mile out. And beneath those, the particular metallic tang of maintained firearms and machine oil. These people had been here a while. They'd built something. He approached from the south, moving through the tree line at a pace that covered ground without announcing itself, watching the structure take shape through the pines. A prison. The kind of institutional concrete and chain-link architecture that American corrections had been building since the 80s, functional and brutal by design. Someone had reinforced the outer fencing with cars and debris, creating kill corridors between the layers. Sharpened stakes in the ground beyond the outer fence. Hand signals being passed between 2 figures on the guard towers that his eyes resolved at distance as a teenage boy and a heavy-set man with a crossbow. A good security. Not professional military, but people who had learned through catastrophic trial and error. He was still 40 yards inside the tree line when the voice came from directly behind him. "Drop the sword. Hands where I can see them." Blade didn't drop the sword. He did, however, go completely still. A different thing, and a deliberate one. The voice was male, controlled, carrying the flat effect of someone who had given this instruction before, and had pulled the trigger on people who didn't comply. The footsteps that had produced it were, and this was the part that earned a fraction of his genuine respect, almost inaudible. Almost. A man who moved like that in a world full of things attracted to sound had learned his craft the hard way. "I heard you coming for the last 200 yards, Blade said without turning. "You dropped your right heel slightly. Fatigue or an old injury?" A pause. The sword. "No." He turned slowly, hands slightly away from his body, sword still in its back sheath. The man facing him was lean, dark-haired, wearing a sheriff's deputy uniform that had been patched and repatched until it was more repair than original fabric. He held a python revolver with the steadiness of someone who had graduated far past the shaking stage of this world. The eyes above the gun were the most interesting thing, exhausted in a way that went bone deep, but still sharp, still thinking. "You're not bit," the man said. It wasn't a question. He was looking at Blade's exposed forearms, checking for the wound that apparently mattered most in this world. "No. You took down 11 of them in the parking lot at the 76 station. Caleb on the south tower was watching through the scope. The gun didn't waver. Said you moved like nothing he'd ever seen. Caleb needs to work on his concealment." Another pause, longer this time. The man was recalibrating. Blade recognized the process. He'd seen it in every serious fighter he'd ever encountered, the moment they stopped seeing what they expected and started seeing what was actually in front of them. "Rick Grimes," the man said finally. "Sir Blade." "Just Blade?" "It's enough." Rick Grimes kept the gun up for another 5 seconds. Blade counted them, and then lowered it to a less aggressive angle. Not holstered, not committed. The posture of a man making a provisional decision he was prepared to revoke. "We have a camp. We have rules." "I'm not interested in your camp," Blade said. "I need information. About this world, about what happened, about how long it's been. After that, I'll be out of your way. Information isn't free anymore. Nothing ever was." They regarded each other in the filtered Georgia sunlight, two men who had both spent years navigating worlds where the wrong decision meant death, sizing up the particular quality of the danger the other one represented. Rick Grimes, Blade had already assessed, was not a man who frightened easily. The set of his jaw, the way he'd approached a visibly armed stranger in the woods alone, that wasn't recklessness. And that was someone who had made peace with the idea of dying and found it clarifying. "Come to the fence," Rick said. "We'll talk there. You don't come inside until my people agree." "Fair." They walked back through the tree line toward the prison, Rick half a step behind and to the left, the position that kept Blade in his peripheral vision while leaving his gun hand-free. Competent. Blade filed the assessment under useful and let the silence sit between them without filling it. At the outer fence, faces appeared. A young Asian man with alert eyes and a baseball bat. A woman with a hatchet who looked at Blade the way experienced fighters looked at things they couldn't immediately categorize. A one-handed man with an aggressive posture compensating for the asymmetry. And further back, watching from the catwalk above the inner fence, a man in a National Guard uniform with a single eye patch who watched Blade with an expression that was entirely different from the others. Not fear, not caution, appetite. Blade filed that one separately. He came in from the South Woods, Rick told the group at the fence. His voice was even, informational. Cleared the lot at the 76 on his own, moving fast. He looked at Blade through the chain link. "I'll ask you straight. What are you? Because whatever answer you give, I'll know if it's a lie." Blade considered the question with the same directness it deserved. In his world, once this was the conversation he'd had 100 times, usually at gunpoint, usually with people who weren't ready for the answer. Something between what you are and what's out there, he said, nodding toward the tree line. But I'm on your side of the line. That's what matters. Rick studied him for a long moment. Behind him, nobody spoke. We'll get you water, Rick said finally. And then you're going to tell us everything. The water was warm and tasted of plastic from the container it had been stored in. And Blade drank it because hydration was tactically relevant and because refusing small gestures from people he might need later was poor strategy. They'd set up a meeting at the outer fence, Blade on the outside, Rick and 3 others on the inside, which was a dynamic Blade found mildly amusing given the circumstances, but chose not to comment on. And the one-eyed man in the National Guard uniform had disappeared from the catwalk sometime during the walk over, which Blade noted and did not like. Men who stopped being visible didn't stop being present. Start with the basics, Rick said. He was sitting on an overturned milk crate, forearms on his knees, the python holstered now, but accessible. The woman with the hatchet, Carol, Rick had called her, in a tone that suggested she was more than she appeared, sat slightly behind him, us watching Blade with quiet, measuring intelligence. The young Asian man, Glenn, stood to Rick's right, with the uncomplicated directness of someone who had learned that overthinking got people killed. How long has it been? Blade asked. Since it started. Rick exchanged a look with Glenn. Little over 1.5 years. Blade processed that against what he'd observed. The infrastructure decay, the vegetation growth, the weathering on the hand-painted signs. Consistent. The dead reanimating. All of them regardless of cause of death? Everyone who dies comes back, Glenn said, unless you destroy the brain. Pathogen. Rick frowned slightly. The CDC, what was left of it, called it a wildfire virus. Doctor there said it was in everyone already. Dormant. Death activates it. Blade was quiet for a moment. He turned that information over carefully, examining it from every angle his knowledge of viral biology and supernatural pathology could reach. Universal dormant infection, not a bite transmission, or not exclusively. The bite mattered for a different reason then. Septic infection most likely, the human body failing and the dormant agent activating at death. In his world, vampirism was a targeted infection, selective, predatory. This was something else entirely. This was a condition of the world itself. You said something between us and them, Carol said. Her voice was mild, conversational, which somehow made it more pointed. What does that mean exactly? It means I'm harder to kill than you are, and I heal faster, Blade said. It means I've been fighting things that don't stay dead for a long time, and I'm good at it. It also means I have dietary requirements that are inconvenient given your current resource situation. He let that sit for a moment. I need blood, human or otherwise. Not much and not often, but that's the reality. The silence that followed was the specific silence of people recalibrating threat assessments. You're a vampire, Glenn said. Half. The distinction mattered to Blade in ways that would take longer to explain than they had time for. I have the strengths. I don't have the weaknesses. Sunlight doesn't affect me. I can't be turned. The things out there, he gestured toward the tree line. They're not vampires. They're something different, and that means most of what I know about killing the undead translates only partially. Most? Rick asked. Decapitation works. Brain destruction works. Those are universal constants, apparently. He paused. The UV grenades I carry, calibrated for vampire photosensitivity, I don't know if they affect walkers yet. The chemical compounds I use are worthless here. The blade works fine. Rick stood up from the milk crate, moved to the fence, and gripped the chain link with both hands, studying Blade with that same bone-deep exhaustion that never quite became defeat. Why are you telling us this? The part about the blood? Because you asked me a direct question, and I gave you a direct answer, Blade said. If I wanted to hide what I am, I'd have stayed in the woods. Another exchange of looks between Rick and Carol. A wordless conversation happening in the shorthand of people who had been through enough together to have developed a private language of glances. It was Glenn who broke the silence, and what he said changed the direction of everything. There's something you should see, he said. Inside the fence, near the generator block. It's been there for about 3 weeks, and none of us can explain it. Rick shot Glenn a look that said this hadn't been the plan. Glenn met it evenly. He knows what he is. He's told us the truth about it. We need someone who knows about this stuff, Rick. We're out of our depth, and you know it. Rick held the look for 3 seconds, then exhaled slowly through his nose. He turned to Blade. I'm going to open the outer gate. You come in, you look at what Glenn wants to show you, and then we talk about whether you stay or move on. You make any move that looks like a threat to anyone in this prison, and I will personally put you down. He said it without heat, which made it more credible than anger would have. We clear? Clear, Blade said. The outer gate opened with a mechanical clang that set 2 walkers at the far end of the kill corridor turning toward the sound, and Blade stepped into the prison compound for the first time. The smell inside the fence was different. Underneath the omnipresent rot of the world outside, there was food and antiseptic, and the accumulated human smell of a community. Children somewhere. He could hear them. The sound landed in a part of him that he kept carefully armored, and he kept walking. Glenn led him around the side of the main block toward the generator area, a concrete outbuilding with a heavy door someone had reinforced with a crossbar. On the ground beside the generator housing, drawn in what appeared to be dried blood, was a symbol. Blade stopped walking. He knew that symbol, had seen it in a manuscript dating to the 14th century, in a vampire cult text that described the boundary markers used by ancient undead to claim territorial dominion across dimensional lines. Someone, or something, in this world had drawn a beacon. And the beacon had worked. The symbol was 8 inches across, precise in its geometry despite being rendered in a medium that dried unevenly, the lines maintaining their integrity with a deliberateness that ruled out accident. Blade crouched over it without touching it, his enhanced vision picking up details the human eye would miss. The layering, 2 distinct applications of the same substance, meaning whoever drew it had returned to reinforce it. It hadn't been done in a moment of panic or madness, and it had been done with intention and knowledge. When did you first notice it? He asked. 3 weeks ago, Glenn said. Tyrese found it when he was checking the generator housing. We thought it was one of ours at first, kids maybe, but... He paused. Nobody here drew it. We asked everyone. Has anything changed in the 3 weeks since it appeared? Behaviorally, with the walkers outside the fence? With people inside the compound? Rick had followed them around the building and stood slightly back, listening. The herds, he said slowly, like the connection was forming as he spoke it. They've been moving differently. Usually they drift, no real direction. Last 3 weeks they've been circling, not attacking the fence, just circling, like they're orbiting something. Blade stood. The circling behavior was consistent with a territorial marker functioning as intended. The symbol didn't attract the undead consciously. It produced a low-frequency resonance that disrupted their aimless drift patterns and created proximity loops. In vampire territorial doctrine, the effect served to concentrate the undead as a defensive perimeter. A living vampire who knew how to read the marker would understand the territory was claimed and populated with an ambulatory deterrent. The problem was that the vampire who'd placed this marker was operating on assumptions about this world that were wrong. There were no living vampires here to read the warning. The walkers being concentrated around the prison weren't serving as a deterrent. They were becoming a siege. This was placed by something from my world, Blade said. Or something that learned from my world. It's a territorial claim marker. Old vampire doctrine, pre-Renaissance. The kind of knowledge that doesn't circulate widely, even among vampires. The silence from Rick and Glenn had a new quality now. You're telling us there's a vampire here? Rick said. An actual vampire, not a walker. Something that knows vampire territorial law well enough to execute this correctly. Yes. Blade straightened and scanned the compound with fresh eyes, recalibrating everything he'd assessed since arrival. Has anyone in your group died and not reanimated? Or reanimated differently, faster, more coordinated, retaining speech? Glenn's expression shifted. Not fear exactly. Something more complicated. He looked at Rick. Rick's jaw tightened. Lori, he said quietly. It cost him something to say it. She died in childbirth, Glenn said carefully, watching Blade. She didn't reanimate. We thought Carl handled it before she could turn. But you're not certain. I'm certain, Rick said, and the flatness in his voice closed that line of inquiry permanently. Blade read it correctly and moved on. Someone else then. Someone you've lost recently whose body you didn't account for. The look that passed between Rick and Glenn this time was longer, heavier, weighted with a specific guilt that Blade recognized as the guilt of people who'd had to make impossible choices under impossible conditions. The prison had a population. People died in this world constantly, and not every body could be tracked. We need to do a count, Glenn said to Rick. After dark, Rick said, when Daryl's back from the supply run. He turned to Blade. You stay inside the fence until then. Carol will find you a cell. I don't need a cell. I know you don't need one. I'm offering you one. There's a difference. Rick held his gaze. You said you're on our side of the line. That means you're inside the fence with us, not outside it alone doing whatever you want, and not until I understand what we're dealing with. It was a reasonable position. Blade had encountered few genuinely reasonable people in his life. Most attempted to control him out of fear or manipulate him out of self-interest. Rick Grimes seemed to be doing neither. He was attempting to manage an unknown variable with the tools available to him, which were persuasion and logic, because the alternative tools, the revolver and the fence, were things he was smart enough to know wouldn't actually work. Blade respected that. One condition, Blade said. The man in the National Guard uniform, the one who was watching from the catwalk when I arrived. I want to know who he is and why he left when I came to the fence. Something moved through Rick's expression too quickly to fully read. His name is Martinez, Rick said, which was an answer that was also not an answer. No, and who does Martinez report to? The pause was a fraction too long. He's from a community called Woodbury, Carol said, from behind Rick, with the careful neutrality of someone delivering information they knew would matter. About 30 miles east, their leaders sent him to open communications. That's what they're calling it. And what are you calling it? Surveillance, she said simply. Blade looked at the symbol on the ground one more time. A vampire's territorial marker, drawing the dead into a siege formation around a prison that was simultaneously being watched by an outside community's intelligence operative. The geometry of the situation was becoming clearer, and none of the angles were comfortable. "I'll take the cell," he said. The cell they gave him was on the ground floor of cell block C, sparse and functional. A cot, a steel toilet, a narrow window that gave him sight lines to the eastern fence and a slice of the road beyond. He sat on the cot without lying down, sword across his knees, and listened to the prison breathe around him. Children's voices 2 blocks over, a baby crying, the sound of a knife being sharpened. Somewhere deep in the building, a man with one eye was making a phone call on what Blade's hearing told him was a disconnected telephone, speaking quietly into it in the tones of a man reporting to someone who wasn't there, or someone who was somewhere else entirely. He closed his eyes and began cataloging everything he knew about vampires who operated through proxy armies, through territorial expansion, through the patient accumulation of resources in hostile environments. The list was long. The night was going to be longer. He didn't sleep. Sleep was something Blade did in controlled environments with established exit routes and a reasonable certainty that nothing in the immediate vicinity could kill him while his guard was down. This place qualified on none of those counts, and beyond the tactical calculus, his mind wouldn't stop working the problem. The symbol, the circling herds, the one-eyed man talking to a dead phone line. The pieces had the shape of something he'd encountered before in his own world. Not the specific details, but the architecture of it. Someone building toward something. Stacking variables patiently, the way a chess player stacks positional advantages 3 moves before the opponent understands what's happening. At 4 a.m, thus, when the prison had settled into its deepest quiet and the watch rotation had just changed, he'd memorized the timing within the first hour. He rose from the cot and moved to the window. The eastern tree line was alive with movement. Not walker movement, which had a characteristic randomness to it even in the circling behavior Rick had described. This was deliberate. 3 figures moving along the fence line in the darkness, staying just beyond the range of the prison's exterior lights, which were solar-powered and dim enough that human eyes on the towers would see nothing. Blade's eyes were not human eyes. He tracked the figures without difficulty. 2 men and a woman, all armed, all moving with the disciplined quiet of people who had done this before. They stopped at the southeast corner of the outer fence, and one of them produced something from a jacket pocket and crouched near the fence post. He was at the cell block door in 4 seconds, in the exterior yard in 12, and at the southeast fence corner in 30, moving along the inner fence line at a pace that generated almost no sound. The figures outside hadn't heard him. He could smell them now. Gun oil, sweat, a specific brand of wood smoke that was different from the prison's fires, carrying traces of a different fuel source. They'd come from Woodbury. 30 miles in the dark meant vehicles parked at distance, a practiced route, genuine operational planning, when the one crouching at the fence post was attaching something to the base of it. Small, electronic, which was notable. Functional electronics in this world represented significant resources. A listening device, or a counter of some kind, or something that sent a signal. Blade had seen similar technology deployed by vampire intelligence networks, which operated on the understanding that information was the only currency that never devalued. He could take all 3 of them quietly right now. It would take less than 8 seconds and would leave no noise that carried to the towers. He stood in the darkness of the inner fence and chose not to, for the same reason he'd chosen to be honest with Rick about his nature at the fence. Because acting unilaterally inside someone else's operation without understanding the full picture was how missions became disasters. He'd learned that lesson the hard way, once, 20 years ago, and the lesson had cost him 6 months of work and 3 people he could have saved. He memorized the device, memorized the faces, memorized their departure route, and went back to his cell. At dawn, he told Rick everything. They were in the prison's common area, a cafeteria that smelled permanently of canned food and collective human anxiety. Rick sat across from him at a long table while Daryl Dixon, who had returned from the supply run an hour before sunrise, road-dusted and carrying a deer across his shoulders with the unceremonious competence of someone for whom this was simply Tuesday, stood against the wall with his crossbow and the particular stillness of a man who listened better than he spoke. "Southeast corner post," Blade said. "Small device, gray casing, attached at ground level. Your people won't see it on a standard fence check unless they know to look at the post base specifically." Rick's face had gone through several things during the account and arrived at controlled fury. "Martinez. He's been reporting your fence patrol patterns, your population numbers, your resource levels. Whoever leads Woodbury has been building a picture of this place for a while." Blade paused. "Tell me about him, like the leader." The quality of silence that followed was different from the ones before. This one had texture, the specific weight of a subject that everyone in the room had complicated feelings about, and nobody wanted to be first to fully articulate. "Philip Blake," Daryl said from the wall, "calls himself the Governor." He said the title with a flatness that communicated everything about how he felt about it. "Runs Woodbury like his personal kingdom, keeps walkers in an arena, he makes survivors fight for the crowd's entertainment. Man's got a daughter he keeps." He stopped, jaw working briefly. He's not right, in the head or anywhere else. "Resources?" Blade asked. "Military vehicles, actual soldiers, former National Guard. Weapons cache that makes ours look like a yard sale," Rick said. "Walls that hold, generators that run. He's built something that functions, and the price for living inside it is doing whatever he says and not asking questions about the parts that are wrong." Blade considered this profile. A functioning autocracy built on controlled violence, intelligence gathering, and the strategic management of fear. Philip Blake had understood something fundamental about this world early. That the collapse of civilization didn't eliminate human political instincts. It just removed the institutional constraints on them. The governor wasn't a symptom of the apocalypse. He was an acceleration of tendencies that had always existed. "The vampire," Blade said. "Whatever place that marker did it 3 weeks ago. Woodbury is 30 miles east. Has Blake acquired any new assets in the last month? Someone new he's keeping close?" Rick looked at Daryl. "There was talk," Daryl said slowly, choosing words with the care of someone who knew they were crossing into territory they couldn't walk back from. "From a survivor we picked up 6 weeks ago before she moved on. Said Blake had something in the basement of his headquarters that he was keeping separate from everything else. Something he was studying." "Something," Blade said. "Or someone." Daryl met his eyes and said nothing, which was its own answer. Outside the cafeteria windows, the Georgia morning was heating up fast, the kind of thick summer day that made everything feel slightly unreal. Blade looked out at the yard, at the children playing near the inner fence under Carol's watch, at the towers where Maggie and Glenn stood their rotation with rifles, and the particular vigilance of people who understood exactly what was at stake. The symbol on the ground near the generator, the circling herds tightening their orbit, a governor with military resources and no moral architecture. And somewhere in the basement of a building 30 miles east, on something that had crossed dimensional lines, and was waiting patiently in the dark. 3 separate threats intersecting around one location. "I need to go to Woodbury," Blade said. Rick looked at him for a long moment. "So do we," he said quietly. "We just haven't figured out how yet." The invitation arrived the same afternoon, which meant the governor had better intelligence than even Blade had credited him for. It came via Martinez, who reappeared at the inner gate at 2 in the afternoon with the relaxed confidence of a man who believed his cover was still intact. Carrying a handwritten note on actual stationery, cream-colored, heavyweight, with the kind of paper that announced its own scarcity as a flex, and requesting an audience with Rick and any members of his group who wished to attend. The note was articulate, measured, extending what it called a mutual security proposition. It mentioned, with the careful casualness of a skilled manipulator, that Woodbury had recently acquired certain unique resources that might prove valuable to the prison community. It did not mention Blade by name, and the omission was more telling than inclusion would have been. Rick read it twice, passed it to Carol, who read it once with the speed of someone who processed information efficiently, and then looked at Blade. "He knows you're here." "He's known since I arrived," Blade said. "The device on the fence post was already in place. Martinez watched me come in through the South Woods and had a report to Woodbury within the hour. The invitation arriving today means Blake absorbed the information, assessed the implications, and decided on approach within 24 hours. He paused. He's fast, and he didn't panic, which means he's encountered things that surprised him before and learned to adapt." "Does he know what you are?" Glenn asked. "He knows I'm something outside his existing categories. The question is whether his new acquisition has told him anything useful about what that means." Blade looked at the note in Rick's hand. "I'll go." Rick set the note down on the cafeteria table with the deliberateness of someone buying themselves 3 seconds of thinking time. "That's not a decision I'd make for you. But I want to be clear about something first." He looked at Blade directly. "Woodbury isn't a potential ally. I've seen what Blake does to people. Whatever he's offering, the price attached to it is something none of us can afford to pay." "I'm not going to negotiate with him," Blade said. "I'm going to see what he has in that basement. And if he doesn't let you leave?" Blade looked at him with an expression that was as close to dry amusement as his face generally got. Rick absorbed it and nodded slowly, conceding the point. The road to Woodbury took 40 minutes in the truck Darrell drove with one hand on the wheel and the other resting on his crossbow. He moving through landscape that had been suburb and farmland and was now becoming something the world was slowly reclaiming with kudzu and silence. Martinez rode with them, sitting in the truck bed with the carefully maintained neutrality of a man performing a role he'd been performing so long he'd partially forgotten it was a performance. Blade sat in the passenger seat and watched the road and said nothing, cataloging the route, the terrain, the choke points, the sight lines. Woodbury announced itself with lights. Actual electric lights on the perimeter wall, which was constructed from vehicles and heavy equipment welded together into a barrier 15 feet high that stretched around what had been a small Georgia town. Generators humming, the smell of diesel and cooked food, and underneath both, the crowd smell. A large human population concentrated in a small space. Several hundred people at minimum. The gate opened for them. Philip Blake was waiting in the town square. He was not what Blade had expected, which was itself informative. Blade's expectations of authoritarian personalities were drawn from decades of encountering vampire lords and human criminals who had structured power around themselves. And they tended toward a particular theatrical self-presentation. Blake was compact, dark-haired, wearing clothes that were practical rather than performative. With a black eye patch over his right socket, and a remaining eye that was doing all the work of two. He smiled when he saw them, and the smile reached the eye, which was the most dangerous kind of smile because it meant the person wearing it had either convinced themselves of their own benevolence or was exceptionally skilled at mimicking it. "Rick," he said warmly, extending a hand. "I'm glad you came." Rick shook it with the wooden courtesy of a man handling something he didn't trust. "Philip." Blake's eye moved to Blade and stayed there. The smile didn't change, but something behind it sharpened. "And you must be the extraordinary individual my people have been telling me about." He extended his hand again. "Philip Blake, welcome to Woodbury." Blade looked at the hand and didn't take it. "I've heard it called that." A fraction of a beat, the smile recalibrating. "Straight to business, and I can respect that." He gestured toward a building at the center of the square, a converted feed store that had become his headquarters by the look of the activity around it. "Why don't we talk inside? I have something I think you'll want to see." The interior of the headquarters was the clearest map of Philip Blake's psychology that Blade could have asked for. Functional and organized at the operational level. Maps on the walls, supply manifests, a communication setup that was genuinely impressive for the circumstances. But underneath the functionality, the decor of a man who had begun to mythologize himself. Framed photographs, a collection of what appeared to be trophies, and on one wall, mounted with a care that suggested reverence rather than utility, a series of hand-drawn diagrams that Blade recognized immediately. Territorial doctrine, vampire hierarchy charts, energy mapping techniques for tracking dimensional anomalies, and someone had given Blake a very specific education. "You've been doing your research," Blade said. "I've had an excellent teacher." Blake moved to a door at the back of the room, heavy, reinforced, the kind of door that kept things in as much as it kept things out, and produced a key. "I want to show you something, Mr. Blade, and I want to make you an offer that I think a man of your particular background will find very difficult to refuse." He unlocked the door, and the smell that came up from the basement hit Blade like a physical force. Old blood, extreme age, the specific chemical signature of a vampire who had been feeding inconsistently and was operating at reduced capacity but was very much alive. Or what passed for alive. And beneath that, fainter but unmistakable, the dimensional residue of a rift that had opened and closed in this location within the last 2 months. He hadn't been the only one pulled through. The basement stairs descended into darkness that human eyes would have needed time to adjust to. Blade's eyes adjusted immediately, and what they showed him made his hand drift toward the sword at his back with the unconscious reflex of decades of survival. The vampire was chained to the far wall, not staked. Chains, heavy iron, wrapped multiple times around limbs that had once been powerful and were now gaunt with deprivation. It hung from the wall like a medieval punishment, and feet inches above the concrete floor, head lolled forward in what might have been unconsciousness or might have been the torpor of extreme blood starvation. Male, once tall, dressed in remnants of clothing that had been expensive in some other world. The face, when it lifted at their approach, was the face of something ancient and starving and very, very angry. Blake descended the stairs behind them with the casual confidence of a man entering his own private gallery. "I found him about 6 weeks ago," he said. "Just outside Woodbury's walls, barely conscious, wearing clothes that didn't make any sense for our world. He'd been in some kind of fight, burns, wounds that should have killed anything human. They healed. That was my first clue." The vampire's eyes found Blade and widened. Not recognition of Blade specifically, they'd never met. but recognition of what Blade was. The same species, the same category of existence. In a world where this creature had been utterly alone, suddenly there was another. His name, Blake continued, is something I can't pronounce. He told me once, early on, before he understood that I wasn't going to be his ally. I've been calling him Subject Zero. Dramatic, I know, but the situation seemed to call for it. He moved closer to the chained figure, close enough that the vampire could have reached him if the chains had allowed even an inch of movement. They didn't, and he's been teaching me about his world, about the rules that govern creatures like him, about how to detect them, contain them, use them. You're a fool, Blade said quietly. You've chained a vampire in your basement, and you've been feeding it information. Feeding it information? Blake laughed, and the sound had genuine amusement in it. Mr. Blade, I've been extracting information. There's a difference. He tells me what I want to know because the alternative is another week without blood. And he's learned that the hunger is worse than anything I can do to him. He gestured at the chains. Iron, old knowledge. Your friend here taught me that silver is superstition. Iron is the real binding agent for your kind, isn't it? Something about the molecular structure interfering with the regenerative capabilities. The vampire's eyes hadn't left Blade. They were speaking a different language now, and the language of predators recognizing each other across a room full of prey. Help me, those eyes said. Kill me, one or the other, but don't leave me like this. What's your offer? Blade asked Blake. Simple. Blake turned to face him fully, and the single eye was bright with the particular intensity of a man who believed he was about to close the most important deal of his life. You're clearly stronger than him, better fed, better equipped, better trained. You know things he doesn't. You're from the same world, but you're not the same creature. Work with me. Help me understand what else might come through those dimensional tiers. Help me prepare for what's coming. What's coming? The war, Blake said simply. You think this... He gestured vaguely at the world above them, at Woodbury, at the apocalypse, is the crisis. It's not. It's the prelude. Something tore holes in reality to drop you and your friend here into our world. That something is still out there, and it's going to keep pushing. More of your kind, worse than your kind. And when that happens, I intend for Woodbury to be the one place on Earth that's ready. Blade looked at the chained vampire, then back at Blake, then at Rick, who had descended the stairs behind them and was standing at the bottom with an expression that suggested he was recalculating everything he thought he knew about the situation. You want me to be your military advisor? Blade said. I want you to be my weapon. Blake's voice dropped, became almost confiding. I've seen what you can do. My people watched you clear that gas station. 11 walkers in under 15 seconds. Your reflexes, your strength. You're not just different from humans, you're better. And I need better. We all need better. The prison needs better, whether Rick wants to admit it or not. The vampire on the wall made a sound, not words. A low, keening note of despair or hunger or both. Blake glanced at it with the mild annoyance of a collector whose specimen was making noise during a tour. He's been like that for weeks, Blake said. Pathetic, really. You'd think something that's lived as long as he claims to have lived would have more dignity. He looked back at Blade. He's yours if you want him. A gift. I have no use for him now that I have you. The offer hung in the basement air, heavy with implications. Blade considered it from every angle he could access. At the tactical angle, Blake was offering resources, intelligence, operational freedom. The strategic angle. Woodbury had military capacity the prison lacked, and a war between the two communities would cost lives that might matter when whatever Blake was afraid of actually arrived. The personal angle. There was a vampire chained to a wall who had been tortured for information for 6 weeks, and Blade had spent his entire existence hunting creatures like this, but also understood exactly what starvation did to a vampire's capacity for rational choice. And the dimensional angle. If something had pulled him and this vampire through into this world, there might be others. More vampires. Worse things. Blake's paranoia might be misdirected, but the underlying threat was real. "I need to think about it," Blade said. Blake's smile didn't waver, but something behind it cooled slightly. "Of course. Take the night. We have comfortable accommodations here. Much more comfortable than the prison, I imagine. Stay. See what Woodbury has to offer. Talk to my people, then decide." It wasn't a request, but it also wasn't a threat. It was the offer of a man who was so confident in his position that he didn't need to threaten. Yet, on the walk back to the surface, Rick fell into step beside Blade and spoke quietly enough that only enhanced hearing would catch it. "You're not actually considering this." "I'm considering everything," Blade said, "including the possibility that Blake is right about what's coming and wrong about everything else, and that the only way to deal with him is to understand exactly how wrong he is before the situation gets worse." "And the vampire?" Blade didn't answer immediately. They emerged into the Georgia evening, is where Woodbury's lights were coming on and the smell of cooked food was drifting from somewhere, and people were living ordinary lives inside walls that kept the dead out and the unknown variables in. "The vampire," Blade said finally, "is going to die. The only question is whether it happens tonight, or whether he's useful first." The night in Woodbury was longer than it should have been. Blade sat in the room they'd given him, comfortable by apocalypse standards, with an actual bed and running water and a window that looked out over the main square. And he didn't sleep. He sat in the chair facing the door, sword across his knees, and he listened to the town breathe around him. The sounds were different from the prison, more organized, more confident. People here went to sleep believing they were safe, and that belief created a different quality of silence, softer at the edges, less vigilant. It was also a silence punctuated by sounds the prison didn't have. Generators cycling, the occasional vehicle, and twice during the night, from the direction of the arena Daryl had mentioned, the sound of walkers moaning in unison like a horrifying chorus. Blake's zoo, his entertainment, his reminder to the people of Woodbury exactly what waited outside the walls and exactly who kept them safe from it. Then at 3 a.m, Blade moved. He left the room without opening the door. The window was sufficient, second floor to ground in a single silent drop, his enhanced legs absorbing the impact like water. The town's patrols were professional but predictable, running routes he'd mapped from his window in the first hour. He slipped between them like smoke, moving through shadows that were darker to human eyes than to his, and reached the headquarters building without being seen. The basement door was locked. The lock lasted 3 seconds. The stairs down were the same as before, but the smell had changed. Fresher blood now, mixed with the old. The vampire had been fed recently, probably to make him presentable for Blade's potential defection, a display of Blake's control over the creature. The vampire's head lifted as Blade approached, and this time there was something different in the eyes. Less despair, more calculation. "You came back," the vampire said. His voice was rougher than it should have been, starvation taking its toll on vocal cords that had lasted centuries. Alone, without the human. Blake thinks I'm considering his offer. Are you? Blade stopped 10 feet from the chained figure, close enough to talk quietly, far enough to react if the chains failed. I'm considering whether you're worth keeping alive. The vampire laughed, a dry, rasping sound. Worth keeping alive? Listen to yourself. We're the same species, and you talk about me like I'm livestock. We're not the same species. Blade's voice was flat. I'm half human. I chose the human side a long time ago. You're pure blood, which means you've spent your existence treating humans as food and territory as conquest. Tell me I'm wrong. A long pause. The vampire's eyes moved over Blade's face, reading him the way vampires read each other. Age, power, threat assessment. What he saw made something shift in his expression. Deacon Frost, the vampire said quietly. That's whose territory I was hunting in when the rift took me. You know that name. Blade's hand tightened on the sword hilt. Frost was dead by his hand, but the name still carried weight. I know it. He was building something. A ritual. Dimensional work, pulling energy from places outside our normal reach. I was investigating his operation, not to stop him, to steal from him. When something went wrong, the ritual activated while I was too close. The vampire's chains clinked as he shifted position. It pulled me through. It might have pulled others. It might have pulled you. I was in a different city, different state. Distance doesn't matter with dimensional work. The ritual created a tear, and the tear pulled anything within its range that was carrying enough supernatural mass. Vampires, Dompiers, anything that registered as other on whatever frequency Frost was using. The vampire leaned forward as far as the chains allowed. There are more of us here. There have to be. The tear was massive. I felt it before it took me. We're not alone in this world. Blade processed that. More vampires in a world with no vampire hunters, no organized resistance, no knowledge of what they were dealing with. Humans fighting walkers with guns and guts, while real predators moved among them unseen. Why should I believe you? Because I have nothing left to lose. The vampire's voice dropped. Blake has been feeding me just enough to keep me alive. He thinks he's breaking me, and he is, slowly. But before I go completely, I want to know that someone from our world makes him pay for what he's done. You're the only chance I have for that. Blade looked at the chains. Iron, thick, wrapped multiple times. The vampire couldn't break them alone. Starvation had weakened him too much. But Blade could. One cut from the titanium sword and the chains would fall. Do it, the vampire said, reading his thoughts. Let me out. I'll help you find the others. I'll help you stop whatever Frost started. Just don't leave me here to rot in this monster's basement. It was the oldest vampire trick in existence. Play on sympathy, on shared origin, on the enemy of my enemy calculus. Blade had seen it deployed hundreds of times, or had watched good hunters fall for it and die for their compassion. He also knew that sometimes, rarely, the enemy of your enemy was actually useful. You try to feed on anyone in this town, Blade said quietly, and I'll put you down so fast you won't have time to regret it. You understand? The vampire nodded, hope flickering in eyes that had gone dead weeks ago. Blade drew his sword. The chains fell in 4 strokes, each one precise, each one avoiding the vampire's skin by millimeters, and the creature slumped forward, catching himself on hands and knees, breathing in the freedom-like air after drowning. For a long moment he stayed there, processing the absence of restraint, the sudden possibility of movement. Then he looked up at Blade, and his eyes were fully vampire again. "Thank you," he said, "for not being stupid." They went up the stairs together, and Blade felt the balance of power in Woodbury shift with every step. The headquarters was empty at this hour. Blake kept regular hours, confident in his security. The vampire moved to the window, looked out at the town, and made a sound that might have been wonder or hunger. "So many," he murmured, "so helpless." "Remember what I said?" "I remember." The vampire turned. "There's something you should know before we find the others." Frost wasn't just experimenting with dimensional work. He was trying to create a permanent bridge, a door that wouldn't close. And if he succeeded, in our world or this one, then what pulled us through was just the beginning. Blade's jaw tightened. Where would he have built it? His main lab was in Eastern Europe, but dimensional work doesn't care about physical location. It's about alignment, about ley lines, about places where reality is already thin. The vampire paused. "There's a place like that near here. I felt it when I arrived. Something about this region. The energy is wrong. Thin, like the universe has a scar here." Before Blade could respond, footsteps sounded above them. Multiple sets, moving with purpose. Blake's patrols, maybe, or something worse. "Go," Blade said. "Find the others. Stay away from humans until I find you." The vampire looked at him for a long moment. Centuries of survival instincts warring with something that might have been gratitude. Then he moved, faster than human eyes could track, out the window and into the night. Blade turned to face the stairs as the door above opened and light spilled down. Philip Blake stood at the top, a rifle in his hands, his single eye burning with an emotion that was no longer friendly. "I was hoping you'd make the right choice," Blake said quietly. "I was really hoping." The rifle came up. Blade moved. The rifle shot echoed through the headquarters building like a thunderclap in close quarters. But Blade was no longer where the bullet aimed. He was already 3 feet to the left and closing, the distance between him and Blake disappearing at a speed that human reflexes couldn't process. Blake's eye widened. Not fear exactly, but the recognition that his calculations had been catastrophically wrong. Blade's hand closed around the rifle barrel and twisted. The weapon tore from Blake's grip, metal groaning under the pressure, and clattered against the wall. Blake stumbled back, reaching for the pistol at his hip, and Blade let him get it clear before moving again. The pistol came up, fired twice, both shots missing because Blade was already inside the lethal range, his forearm slamming into Blake's wrist and breaking it with a sound like snapping kindling. The governor screamed. It was a human sound, raw and surprised and furious all at once. He fell back against the door frame, cradling his ruined wrist. And for the first time since Blade had met him, the careful mask of control had completely shattered. Beneath it was something ugly and desperate and utterly convinced of its own right to rule. "You think this changes anything?" Blake gasped, sweat beading on his forehead. "You think breaking my wrist stops what's coming? I have an army out there. I have weapons. You have nothing I can't take." Blade's voice was quiet, conversational almost. "You chained one of my kind in your basement. You tortured him for information. You thought that made you strong." He shook his head slowly. "It made you a target." From outside, the sounds of alarm were already rising. Shouts, running feet, the Woodbury militia mobilizing, responding to the gunshots. Blake's eye flicked toward the window, toward the promise of rescue, and something like hope flickered across his face. "They'll be here in seconds," he said. 30 armed men. You're fast, but you're not faster than bullets from every direction." Blade looked at him for a long moment, then reached into his coat and produced a small, cylindrical object. UV grenade. One of the ones he'd been carrying since Chicago, never used in this world because he hadn't known if it would work on walkers. Time to find out. He armed it with a thumb press and tossed it through the window. The explosion was different from what it would have been in his world, less light and the UV spectrum diffusing differently through this atmosphere. But the effect on the Woodbury militia was immediate and devastating. Men screamed. Weapons clattered. Through the shattered window, Blade saw them clawing at their eyes, temporarily blinded by a wavelength their retinas had never encountered. The grenade hadn't killed anyone. It didn't need to. "What did you do?" Blake whispered. "Bought time." Blade moved to the window, assessed the chaos below. The militia was disorganized and panicking, exactly the opposite of what an effective fighting force needed to be. Somewhere in the town, he could hear walkers responding to the noise, the herd outside Woodbury's walls beginning to press against the defenses. And somewhere out there, a freed vampire was hunting. Blade turned back to Blake. The governor had managed to get to his feet, cradling his broken wrist, backing toward the stairs that led to the roof. His face was a mask of hate and fear and something that might have been respect. The recognition that he had finally encountered something he couldn't manipulate or control. "This isn't over," Blake said. "You hear me? Even if you kill me, even if you burn this town to the ground, what's coming is bigger than both of us. Frost's ritual, the bridge, it's already happening. You can't stop it." "Maybe not." Blade advanced, slow and deliberate. But I can stop you." The roof door slammed behind Blake as he disappeared through it. Blade followed, taking the stairs 3 at a time, bursting out onto the rooftop in time to see the governor stumbling toward the edge, a flare gun in his good hand aimed at the sky. Blake fired. The flare arced upward, red against the night, a signal that meant something Blade didn't understand but could guess. Reinforcements. A contingency plan. On some piece of Blake's strategy that he'd put in motion days ago, waiting for exactly this moment. "You want to know what's coming?" Blake laughed, wild and desperate. "Look." Blade looked. Beyond Woodbury's walls, beyond the circling herd of walkers that had been pressing closer for weeks, lights were appearing in the darkness. Vehicle lights. Multiple vehicles, moving in formation, carrying armed men who responded to the flare with practiced efficiency. Blake's people, not the Woodbury militia. These were different, harder, military training, military discipline, the kind of force a man like Blake would keep hidden, waiting for the moment when he needed overwhelming power. "You think the prison is your safe harbor?" Blake shook his head. "By dawn, Rick Grimes and everyone he loves will be dead. And you," he pointed at Blade with his broken hand, and tears of pain and fury streaming down his face. "You'll watch them die before I put you back in that basement and finish what I started." Blade looked at the approaching vehicles, at the walls of Woodbury, at the chaos spreading through the streets below. He looked at the symbol on the ground near the generator that he'd seen earlier, the vampire territorial marker that had started all of this. And he made a choice. He grabbed Blake by the collar and threw him off the roof. The governor screamed all the way down, 3 stories to the street below, landing among the blinded militia with a sound that was more crunch than thud. He was still alive. Blade's hearing caught the ragged breathing, the broken bones, the desperate will to survive. But he wasn't getting up anytime soon. Blade leapt after him, landing in a crouch that cracked the pavement and stood over the broken body of Woodbury's leader. "Tell your people to stand down," he said quietly. Tell them the governor is done. Tell them the deal with the prison is off, or I finish this right now." Blake looked up at him through the haze of pain and shock, and for a moment, something almost like sanity flickered in his remaining eye. He saw, perhaps for the first time, exactly what he was dealing with. Not a man, not a monster. Something in between that had chosen a side and would not be moved from it. "Do it," Blake whispered. "Kill me. See what happens." Blade looked at the approaching vehicles, at the militia beginning to recover their vision, at the walkers pressing against the walls, at the night full of threats converging on one point. "No," he said. "You're going to watch what happens next. You're going to see what real leadership looks like." He turned and walked toward the prison truck, where Rick and Daryl were already fighting their way through the chaos to reach him. Behind him, Woodbury's walls began to fall. The truck tore through Woodbury's gates with Daryl at the wheel, and the sound of crunching metal drowning out the screams behind them. Blade sat in the passenger seat, sword across his knees, watching the town recede in the side mirror. Flames were already rising from somewhere near the headquarters. The UV grenade had done more damage than intended, or maybe the freed vampire had circled back. Either way, Woodbury was burning, and then Philip Blake was lying broken in the street while his militia tried to remember who they were supposed to follow. "The prison," Rick said from the back seat. His voice was tight, controlled, the voice of a man who had seen too much to panic, but not enough to stop caring. Blake said by dawn, if he had people moving on the prison. He did. Blade's voice was flat. The vehicles we saw coming in, they weren't reinforcements for Woodbury. They were a strike force already in motion. Now Blake lit the flare to coordinate timing, not to call for help. Daryl swore and pushed the truck faster, the engine complaining as they tore down roads that hadn't seen maintenance in 2 years. The landscape blurred past, kudzu-covered trees, abandoned cars, the occasional walker lurching toward the sound and falling behind too quickly to matter. 20 minutes. 15. The prison's lights appeared through the trees. Eastos and Blade's enhanced vision picked out details the others couldn't see yet. Figures moving along the fence line. Muzzle flashes, the distinctive sound of automatic weapons fire mixing with the moans of walkers and the shouts of human defenders. "They're already here," he said. The truck skidded into the prison's outer perimeter, and Blade was moving before it fully stopped, sword in hand, assessing the battlefield with the cold efficiency of centuries. The governor's strike force had hit the south fence, the same section where Martinez had planted the listening device, the same area Blake had been mapping for weeks. They'd brought heavy weapons, military surplus, enough firepower to punch through the prison's defenses if they concentrated on one point. They hadn't counted on what was inside. Glenn was on the catwalk above the south gate, picking off attackers with a rifle while Maggie fed him magazines. Carol was at the inner fence with a hatchet and an expression that said she'd already killed today and was willing to do it again. The one-handed man, Merle, Daryl's brother, was actually laughing as he fired into the assault force from a flanking position, the sound carrying something unhinged and effective. But the fence was going to fall. Blade could see it. The concentrated fire was weakening the chain link. And behind the human attackers, a herd of walkers was already pressing toward the gap, drawn by the noise and the blood. If the fence went down, the prison would be overrun in minutes. He moved. The first attacker never saw him coming, just a blur in the peripheral vision. And then the titanium blade was taking his head at an angle that left the body standing for a full second before it crumpled. The second turned at the sound and caught the sword through the chest, blade piercing body armor like paper. when the third got off a burst of automatic fire that went wild because Blade was already inside it, his offhand grabbing the barrel and forcing it skyward while the sword completed its arc. 3 down, 4, 5. The assault force was 12 men total. Blade had counted from the truck, and he killed 7 of them in the first 18 seconds after leaving the vehicle. The remaining 5 broke, their discipline shattering at the sight of something that moved like that, killed like that. He didn't stop like anything human should stop. They ran toward the tree line, toward the vehicles they'd left there, toward the hope of survival. Blade let them go. The fence was the priority. He reached the breach as the first walkers pushed through, their dead hands reaching for the living beyond. The sword took the first one's head, then the second, then the third, a rhythm of destruction that he'd practiced for decades. Behind him, Rick and Daryl had joined the defense, with their guns adding to the chaos, their voices coordinating the prison's resistance. But there were too many walkers. The herd was massive. Blake's territorial marker had been working for weeks, pulling them in from miles around, concentrating them around this location. And now, with the gunfire and the blood and the open fence, they were finally getting what they'd been circling toward. Fall back. Rick's voice, cutting through the noise. Inner fence. Everyone inside. Now. The prison's defenders retreated in good order. They'd practiced this, drilled for it, knew exactly what to do when the outer fence failed. Glenn covered from above, while Maggie hauled civilians through the inner gate. Carol pulled a wounded man behind cover and applied pressure to his shoulder without breaking stride. Merle kept firing, still laughing, because some people processed trauma that way. Blade stayed at the breach. The walkers came through in a steady stream, attracted by the living flesh so close, and Blade met them one after another after another. The sword never stopped moving. His arms never tired. His breathing remained steady, measured, the breathing of a machine designed for exactly this kind of work. But even a machine had limits, and the herd was infinite. He'd killed 47 when he heard the sound, 53 when he recognized it, 61 when he allowed himself to look up and see what his ears had already told him, at the vehicles returning. Not the strike force, they were gone. Those 5 survivors already disappearing into the Georgia wilderness. These were different, bigger. Military transports, multiple of them, moving in formation toward the prison from the east. And leading them, standing in the bed of the first truck with a rifle in his good hand and madness burning in his remaining eye, was Philip Blake. The governor had gotten up. He'd gotten up. And he'd gathered whatever forces remained loyal. And he'd followed the sound of gunfire to the prison because broken bones and a shattered wrist and the humiliation of being thrown from a roof weren't enough to stop him. Nothing was enough to stop him. That was the terrifying truth about men like Blake. They didn't know how to quit, because quitting would mean admitting they'd been wrong about themselves from the beginning. Blade looked at the approaching vehicles, looked at the walkers still pressing through the breach, looked at the inner fence where Rick's people were fighting for their lives. And he made a choice. He reached into his coat and pulled out his last UV grenade, his last serum syringe, his last piece of technology from a world that wasn't this one. Then he turned to face the herd and began to fight his way toward the governor. The sun was rising over the prison when it ended. Blade stood in the field between the fences, almost surrounded by bodies, walkers and humans both, the dead piled in grotesque heaps that the living would spend days clearing. His sword was still in his hand, though his arm finally ached with an exhaustion he hadn't felt in decades. His coat was torn in 3 places, his skin marked with cuts that had already healed, his body demanding blood he couldn't afford to stop and take. Philip Blake lay at his feet. The governor's remaining eye was open, staring at the sky, seeing nothing. The rifle was still in his hand, unfired because Blade had closed the distance before he could pull the trigger. The broken wrist didn't matter anymore. Nothing mattered anymore. Behind Blade, the prison's inner fence held. Rick's people were alive. The children were safe. The herd was finally, slowly, beginning to disperse now that the noise and the blood and the territorial marker had been silenced. Blade looked down at the body of the man who had tried to build an empire on the bones of the apocalypse, and he felt nothing. No satisfaction, no triumph, just the same cold certainty that had driven him since he was a child watching his mother die from a vampire's bite. Monsters wore different faces in different worlds. Some had fangs. Some had eye patches and speeches about security and the hard choices that leaders had to make. Some walked in herds. Some walked alone. His job was the same everywhere. Rick appeared at his side, breathing hard, his deputy's uniform soaked with blood that wasn't his. He looked at Blake's body, then at Blade, then at the field of the dead stretching toward the tree line. "We need to talk," Rick said. "About what happens now, about what you are, about whether you stay." Blade sheathed his sword and looked toward the rising sun. "I stay," he said. "For now, until I find the others." "What others?" "The ones who came through with me, the ones still out there." He turned to face Rick fully. "Your world has a vampire problem you didn't know about. I'm going to fix it." Rick studied him for a long moment, and something shifted in his expression. Not trust, exactly. Rick Grimes didn't trust anyone fully, which was why he was still alive. But something adjacent to trust. Something that might grow into it over time. "Then I guess we're allies," Rick said. Blade looked at the prison, at the people emerging from behind the inner fence to survey the damage, at the children who were alive because a group of flawed, frightened, heroic humans had refused to quit. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I guess we are." The prison held. Woodbury burned. Philip Blake fed the crows. In the weeks that followed, Blade became something unexpected in Rick Grimes's community. Not quite a member, not quite an outsider, but a presence that shifted the balance of survival in ways no one could fully measure. He hunted walkers with mechanical efficiency. He trained those who wanted to learn how to fight faster, smarter, deadlier. He stayed in his cell at night and never explained where he went during the long, dark hours when even the guards slept. And somewhere in the Georgia wilderness, a vampire who owed him a debt was tracking the dimensional signatures of others who had fallen through Frost's failed ritual. Others who might be predators or prey or something in between. Others who would need to be found before they found the human survivors first. The multiverse had torn open and spilled its contents into a world already drowning in the dead. Blade had chosen his side the day he was born, half monster, half man, whole hunter. That choice hadn't changed just because the universe had. He stood on the prison's catwalk as the sun set over the trees, his sword a weight across his back, his senses reaching for threats that human eyes couldn't see. Behind him, children laughed. A baby cried. Someone was cooking something that almost smelled like real food. Eric Brooks, the Daywalker, survivor of one apocalypse and hunter of another, watched the darkness gather and waited for what came next.